Hello. So Toronto has the largest streetcar network in all of North America, and not only are they a very iconic part of the city, but they also move a crap ton of people. In 2019, over 300,000 people used the streetcars every single day, which was almost as much as the entire subway system in Philadelphia. And it's more than the amount of people subscribed to my YouTube channel, so you know what to do. But despite how much people ride them, the streetcars are also really slow. They constantly get stuck in traffic, they have to wait at red lights, and their speed is often limited to 10 kilometers per hour. There's actually a study comparing the speeds of different tram systems around the world, and Toronto streetcars came dead last, and it's not even close. In fact, you can probably run faster than the streetcar. Over the summer, this one marathon runner did a race against every streetcar line in the city, and he won every single time by pretty big margins. He also did a race with a whole news crew, and they still won, so it's not like you have to be a marathon runner to beat them. Now, just to clarify, streetcars and trams are basically the same thing. Streetcar is just the term used in North America, while other parts of the world call it a tram. And when done right, trams are usually the best way to get around the city. They're super fast, convenient, and just fun to ride because you can see the world go by outside the window. But I swear to God, the streetcars in Toronto don't have any other purpose than to rage bait people. So the first reason why they're so slow is because cars can drive on the streetcar tracks, which means the streetcars get stuck in traffic. This means you'll be standing in a crowded streetcar during rush hour with hundreds of other people, and everyone stuck behind a single driver trying to make a left turn. This is made worse by the fact that most downtown streets have an entire lane taken up by parking, so in many cases, streetcars and private vehicles both have to share just one lane. Street parking is also a big problem during the winter because Toronto usually plows the snow onto the side of the road, and that means drivers often park their cars way too far from the curb, and they end up blocking the streetcar track. Sometimes people end up having to physically push the car out of the way so that traffic can get moving again. Teamwork makes the dream work. So because they constantly get delayed by traffic, the streetcars never follow a consistent schedule. They often bunch up together and create huge gaps between trains, and that's why you'll often wait half an hour for a streetcar, only for 10 of them to show up all at the same time. To fix these gaps, the streetcars often have to make a short turn, which means instead of going all the way to the final stop, the streetcar has to turn around earlier. So sometimes they'll just announce a short turn out of nowhere, and everyone has to get off the streetcar and wait for the next one. The obvious solution here is to just remove parking on all streetcar routes and separate the tracks from cars. But I have an even better idea. I think we should stick one of those industrial shredders to the front of every streetcar. I mean, have you seen those videos on TikTok? These things are unstoppable. The core issue here is that cars in Toronto always have to come first at the expense of everything else. The car-driving suburbanite has a very tight chokehold on Toronto's politics, which means every urban planning and transportation issue has to cater to cars, even if it makes public transit worse. Now, something important to understand is that unlike the United States or other parts of Canada, most people in Toronto's suburbs are actually quite supportive of public transit. So it's not about whether or not we should have public transit, it's more about priorities. And if cars are at the very top of the priority list, everything else is at the very bottom. Toronto's streetcar network used to be a lot bigger than it is today, but several lines were torn out in the 20th century with the goal of replacing them with subways. And one of the main motivations behind this was to get public transit off the streets so that it wouldn't get in the way of cars. For example, in 1954, the chairman of the Toronto Transit Commission, or TTC, said that building a Queen Street subway would eliminate 80% of all streetcars in downtown Toronto and free up space on the roads for car traffic. Another news article from that year wrote that the main purpose of the subway was a congestion relief project. So basically, public transit in Toronto has always been built primarily for the benefit of car drivers, not for transit riders. And to this day, the main conservative ideology in Toronto is that public transit can only exist when it's not in the way of cars.
Folks, subways. They don't want these damn streetcars blocking up our city.
And that basically sums up all the issues with Toronto streetcars. One of the main advantages of trams is that they're super accessible. Unlike a subway, you don't have to go up or down long staircases and elevators. And unlike a bus, you don't have to climb a big step to board the vehicle because tram platforms are usually at the same height as the tram. But in Toronto, most of the streetcar stops don't have a proper platform. The streetcar stops in the middle of the road, and people have to walk into the middle of the road to get on or off. That means a person on a wheelchair has to push a button beside the door, which alerts the driver to walk out and activate a ramp. And this whole process takes ages. Like, you could probably speedrun Minecraft in the time it takes to activate this ramp. Car drivers are supposed to stop behind the streetcar when the doors open, but that doesn't always happen. In the past decade, 141 people were hit by cars that drove past the doors, and most of them were severely injured. In response, the streetcars will finally get cameras to automatically ticket drivers, but this won't actually start until 2026. The city has also started painting these zigzaggy road markings at certain streetcar stops, and this is definitely an improvement. But an even better solution is to physically raise the road up to the height of the sidewalk, just like how bike lanes are raised up at bus stops. At the busiest locations, cars can be removed completely. For example, when this tram stop was added here in Amsterdam, they closed this part of the street to cars, making room for a platform and a protected bike lane. You can see that according to the sign, only trams, buses, bicycles, and delivery vehicles are allowed, while cars have to go down another street. This should also be done here in Toronto as well, but instead, we're doing the complete opposite. This intersection used to have a streetcar platform, but they removed it back in 2016. So now it's just a very wide traffic lane, and people have to board the streetcar from the road. This is a prime example of how the convenience of drivers is treated more importantly than the safety and accessibility of transit riders. Once again, public transit can only exist when it's not in the way of cars. Now, okay, you might point out that Toronto does have streetcar lines with platforms and separated lanes, but they're still painfully slow. So what's up with that? Well, first of all, these platforms are still not at the same height as the streetcar for some reason, which means you still need to climb a big step to board the streetcar, and they still need to deploy that stupid accessibility ramp, even though there's a platform. Another problem is that the stops are way too close together. The average distance between tram stops in other cities is around 400 meters apart, but in Toronto, the stops are only 200 to 300 meters apart, sometimes even less. Now, removing stops can be quite controversial, and some transit experts don't even think that it would make that big of a difference, but in some places, it only takes like 1 or 2 minutes to walk between two streetcar stops, so removing at least some of these would definitely speed up trips for a lot of people. This is also part of the reason why the quality of the streetcar stops is so bad, because there's just so many that improving all of them would be insanely expensive. In other cities, tram stops will have high quality shelters and information screens that show when the next train will arrive. But in Toronto, streetcar stops are usually just a sign strapped to a pole. If you're lucky, there might be a bus shelter, but that's pretty much it. Now, an even bigger problem are intersections. Many tram systems around the world have Transit Signal Priority, or TSP, which allows vehicles to activate a green light at every intersection. That means they never have to wait at a red light, unless there's another tram coming from the other direction. This makes a lot of sense because trams can carry up to hundreds of people per vehicle, so giving them green lights drastically reduces the person delay at an intersection. But in Toronto, the streetcars have to wait at every single red light. And what's even worse is that some intersections have left turn phases. So even once the light turns green, the streetcar still has to wait for a few drivers to make left turns. That's insane. This is another obvious example of how Toronto prioritizes the convenience of a few drivers over dozens of transit riders. Another major issue are the track switches, which are the mechanisms in the train tracks that change the direction of the train. This is normally not a problem at all. Most modern tram systems use wireless signals to automatically change the track switch, and they work super well. This is pretty basic stuff. But instead of using the same standardized track switches that other cities use, the TTC created their own system. And unsurprisingly, it fucking sucks. Here's how fast a tram should normally be able to get through an intersection. It's pretty fast. But watch how long it takes for Toronto streetcars to do the same thing. That's because these custom track switches are very unreliable. They often flip when no one tells them to, and sometimes they outright fail. So the TTC has implemented several protocols and speed restrictions at every track switch so that the streetcars don't derail. For example, when the streetcar approaches a track switch, the driver has to pause and look out the front window to make sure the switch is pointed in the right direction. Yeah, so even when the light is green, the streetcar still has to slow down and stop so the driver can look at the track switch. And once the streetcar starts driving over the switch, they have to crawl through at very slow speeds. And if that wasn't bad enough, two streetcars are not allowed to pass each other over a switch so that if one derails, it won't crash into the other. The TTC claims that these rules are necessary for safety, but they have completely crippled the streetcars into very, very slow speeds. And ultimately, they could fix all these problems by just using a standard switching system that other cities have reliably used for decades. Part of the reason why these custom switches are so unreliable is because many of them are super old and need to be replaced. But that's taking a long time because public transit in Toronto is chronically underfunded. And also, no one even bothers to produce these weird custom switches anymore. There is only one single company in the entire world that still supplies the replacement parts. And apparently the original design files were lost in a fire. Great. Some track switches are not even electric and have to be manually controlled. That means the streetcar driver has to go outside the vehicle and physically move the switch with a big metal stick. Now, to be fair, this only happens when the streetcar makes a diversion, but it is ridiculous how a modern tram system in 2025 still has to operate like this. So Toronto has this massive streetcar network that moves hundreds of thousands of people every day, but it's completely sabotaged by car-centric policies, outdated technology, decades of underfunding, and, I don't know, just pure stupidity. So how did we even get here? Well, historically, almost every town and city around the world was built and connected by streetcars. Cities like Los Angeles and Chicago had the biggest electric rail networks in the world. But as North America suburbanized in the 20th century, public transit was neglected and tons of money was poured into new highways instead. As a result, pretty much all these streetcar systems were eventually torn out. Thankfully, most of Toronto's streetcars were saved by advocates in the 1960s, but apart from getting some new vehicles, we never really changed how we operated the streetcars to give them priority over cars. We're basically running Victorian-era trams down 21st century streets. That's why a lot of people firmly believe that streetcars are outdated and need to be replaced by buses and subways. But that's not because streetcars are inherently bad, It's because Toronto streetcars in particular are treated like a form of historical preservation rather than a serious transit system. Buses simply don't have the capacity to replace the streetcars. And back in 2017, when the Quay streetcar was shut down for maintenance, the TTC was spending an extra $1 million per month to run replacement buses. And it required 60 buses to provide the same level of service as 45 streetcars. And let's not pretend that buses don't get stuck in traffic either. That's exactly what happened when they shut down the Spadina streetcar last year for maintenance and replaced them with the Spadina bus. It was a complete mess. There were 10 buses in a row, all stuck in the same traffic as the cars, and no one was getting anywhere. It got so bad that the city had to add temporary bus lanes to speed them up. So that should go to show that streetcars are not inherently worse than other types of transit. This is not a technical issue, it's a political issue. We're actually building several new streetcar lines right now, and they're referred to as LRT. LRT stands for Light Rail Transit, and it's a pretty broad term, but in North America, it usually refers to a modern type of tram that's faster and higher capacity. It's basically the streetcar 2.0. So these new LRT lines will be much nicer than the legacy streetcars, but they're still sabotaged by car-centric policies. The infamous Eglinton LRT is a major east-west transit line that Toronto has needed for decades. But this $13 billion transit line still doesn't have signal priority at intersections, which means hundreds of people on these trains will have to wait at red lights, just so a few car drivers can make left turns. Part of this line runs above ground like a typical tram, but the entire central and western portions of it were put underground. Now, you might think that's a good thing, but when you put most of your tram underground, it kinda defeats the whole purpose of building a tram, because at that point, why don't you just build a subway? The reason we chose to build an LRT in the first place is because they're usually cheaper than subways. But since we dug these deep tunnels and built these big stations anyways, we ended up spending just as much money as a subway, but we're not getting the same speeds and capacity as a subway. And making this project so overcomplicated is a big reason why it's been under construction for 15 years, and there's still no opening date. That's right, this one tram line started getting built when I was in 3rd grade, and it's still not done, even though I'm still in 3rd grade. So building these transit mega projects is already pretty expensive and slow to begin with, but our obsession with putting everything underground is making it 10 times worse. And that's why you can't just replace all the streetcars with subways. Toronto desperately needs better transit, and fixing the streetcars is a relatively easy way to achieve that, without spending billions of dollars and waiting decades. A great example is the streetcar on King Street, which is quite literally the king of all streetcars. It moved over 65,000 people per day in 2017, making it the busiest surface route in Toronto by far. However, it was also one of the slowest streetcar lines in the city because of all the car traffic. Cars took up majority of the space on King Street, even though they only moved 1/3 of all the people taking the streetcars. King Street itself is also the financial, cultural, and entertainment center of the city. It runs right through the financial district and is where you'll find Toronto's most famous restaurants and theaters. It's also where they host the Toronto International Film Festival every year. And that's why in 2017, the city created the King Street Transit Priority Corridor, a project that would give priority to the King streetcar and create more public spaces. The pilot forced cars to only make right turns and drive one block at a time, while left turns and through traffic would be banned. Road space was also converted into temporary streetcar boarding platforms and dining patios for nearby restaurants. This was initially a huge success. Streetcar travel times were a lot faster and more consistent, and ridership increased to 90,000 riders per day in 2019. It really goes to show that not a lot of effort is actually needed to fix the streetcars. The city eventually made the project permanent in 2019, But since then, not much has changed. There's still no detailed plan to redesign King Street, and so the temporary platforms from the pilot project are still here, except they're now in terrible shape. This is partly thanks to the taxi industry. Right before the pilot project was initially improved, the city gave an exemption to taxis overnight, as cab companies argued that taxis are part of the public transit system. To be clear, taxis are not public transit, because, first of all, they're not public. And also, the amount of people that taxis move is a tiny fraction compared to the amount of people taking the streetcars. But giving this exemption basically watered down the entire project and made things so much more confusing and complicated. This confusion and the lack of a proper redesign only made things worse over time. In 2023, the University of Toronto found that drivers were making 6,800 illegal turns onto King Street per day, and more than 99% of them were not ticketed. This got so bad that the King Streetcar became even slower than it was before, and the city had to deploy police officers to direct traffic. But even with police enforcement, the King Streetcar is still super slow, mainly due to those outdated track switches and the lack of signal priority. Remember that one marathon runner who raced the streetcars? Yeah, when he raced the King Streetcar, he beat it by nearly 20 minutes.
With me beating it by a total of 18 minutes. So yeah, if you're late, run.
This project was very similar to the transformation of George Street in Sydney, Australia. Since 2012, the street was turned into a beautiful pedestrian boulevard with the tram running down the middle. But King Street in Toronto doesn't look anywhere near as good. It's been 8 years since the project started, and the only improvement they made to the streets are these plastic platforms, which are still not fully accessible. Like, why? This project has faced tons of political pressure from the very start, but without much improvement, it hasn't really inspired much support, which makes it even more vulnerable to attacks from suburban politicians. For example, the King Streetcar was recently diverted for construction, and the city councillor Brad Bradford passed a motion to restore car access on a portion of King Street. Although this was only temporary, it did set a major precedent, because the current Premier of Ontario is Doug Ford, and this guy loves to dictate what goes on the streets of Toronto. Since last year, his government has been fighting to rip out bike lanes on major downtown streets, and recently they passed a law that completely banned speed cameras. So it is totally possible that Doug Ford will one day decide to eliminate the King Street Transit Priority Corridor, and there's nothing Toronto can do about it. The King Street project shows that fixing the streetcars can be very quick and simple, as long as we aren't afraid to make bold, radical decisions. Toronto needs a strong, progressive leader who can stand up to these suburbanites and turn the streetcars into a world-class tram system. And we need that before some other politician decides to tear them out. If you're in Toronto and you want to help fix the streetcars, please vote in the next election for someone who actually cares about public transit. In the meantime, I personally recommend checking out the advocacy group TTC Riders. They have active campaigns right now for signal priority and transit-only lanes, so at the very least, go sign their petitions. What's even better is becoming a volunteer. I recently worked with them on a wayfinding campaign where we redesigned some signs and put them up at a subway station. In the end, we actually pushed the TTC board to approve a new wayfinding strategy. So I can say from firsthand that advocacy does work, and you yourself can make a difference by volunteering. Links will be down below. Goodbye.